So I'm going to begin my talk by just mentioning a few things. So I'm Pakistani background, and so I come from a lineage where women's voices are either hidden or oppressed. And actually, in some cases, women have been killed for speaking their truth. So there is a sense of vulnerability here right now, speaking about some of these issues, especially to a predominantly white audience. Professionally, I work in the NHS as an anaesthetist. I'm also in psychedelic research at the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial. And I'm advocating for the rights of Indigenous people through the not-for-profit Blessings of the Forest, who are leading the way in the fair trade of Iboga. My different roles and experiences allow me to bridge multiple worlds and allow me to have a broad perspective on a number of things. So, for example, anaesthesia is not simply just knocking people out for surgery, as people say to me. It's actually a form of extreme space holding, if you will. So, for example, I have treated people with life-threatening injuries in one of the London terrorist attacks. I have worked in intensive care in the front line of COVID, where I've had to put people in induced comas, knowing that I would potentially be the last person that they would see. I have been to Africa with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. There, we provided emergency services 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 6 weeks straight. I really appreciated other people, the local people's ways of doing things in their own set and setting. And actually, a lot of them became my teachers, showing me how to deliver anaesthesia in their way. Now, I am specializing in chronic pain within anaesthesia. And it was through working with these patients that I realized the need for new and novel treatments. So that's what took me to the Centre for Psychedelic Research, where we are now working on a psilocybin for chronic pain study. And I've been in psychedelics for 2.5 years now, and I've started to become aware of the compound Ibogaine, which, as we've heard today, is being used in the treatment of addictions with promising results. But I became curious about the other perspective. What is the other narrative? So that of the Indigenous people of Gabon, which is where this medicine has been sourced from, the main source for over 50 years. So I came across the work of Blessings of the Forest, who are working to support Indigenous people of Gabon. And now my role there as medical reciprocity manager is to build relationships between the Western scientific communities and the Indigenous people of Gabon to ensure and to help create reciprocal relationships. So all of that, combined with the fact that I have had the felt experience of having an underrepresented voice, is what is bringing me to talk about this topic today. So we've already heard about what Ibogaine is. I want to just focus a little bit on Iboga. Iboga is the root of the Iboga tree, which is found throughout Central West Africa. But mainly, the main source has been from Gabon, and it's found throughout the rainforests of Gabon. And Indigenous people there have used this for millennia, often in their traditions as a sacrament associated with their ancient practice of buiti. They either chew it directly or use it in root shavings, but it has been declared a national cultural heritage by their government. Ibogaine is just one alkaloid which is extracted from Iboga, and it's either converted into Ibogaine hydrochloride or used as a total extract, and that is what we use in the West. Now, having Gabon being the main source of this medicine has put a massive pressure on the natural resource. So this is a picture of Gabon. This would actually be the last view near here that many Gabonese people would have seen when they were extracted from their homeland during the transatlantic slave trade. Now, in the last 50 years, another extractive process has been allowed to continue, and that is of Iboga. 75% is the estimate of deforestation of Iboga trees from the public domain in Gabon. The main reason for this is an increase in international demand drives up Iboga poaching. So poachers from neighbouring countries often will go into the hearts of the rainforests where the Iboga source is found, and then they will remove the roots in a non-sustainable manner. And then this will be sold online, being posed as from an ethical source, where in fact it's not. Associated with this has been ivory poaching, because elephants eat the fruits of the Iboga trees, and poachers, having this knowledge, will follow the tracks of the elephants to find the roots and then also take the ivory. So in response to the diminishing resources, the government of Gabon did two things. They stopped the export of Iboga in 2019, and they signed the Nagoya Protocol, which has been implemented this year. So the Nagoya Protocol is part of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And what it means is that if a person is profiting from a genetic resource, i.e. Iboga from Gabon, then you have to share those benefits should be shared in an equal manner, in a fair and equitable way. I'll explain what this means in a moment. Blessings of the Forest are a community interest company in the UK with a non-governmental organisation in Gabon. And they were created to support the traditional and indigenous people in the fair trade Iboga effort. So one of the main things that they do is support community Iboga farms. So where communities in villages come together and they will grow and cultivate Iboga trees. And the idea being that when these Iboga trees are ready for harvest, then that can be sold to the international customer and a fair price determined in advance. That is a fair trade aspect. Now, with the Nagoya Protocol, that has to be led by the government. Blessings of the Forest are independent of that process. The first pilot scheme under the Nagoya Protocol has just happened. So the first batch of Iboga roots have been sent from Gabon to Canada, and they're being analysed for Ibogaine content. Based on the Ibogaine content, the price of Iboga from that plantation will be determined. So that is a fair trade aspect, but on top of that, we would like to see reciprocity. So just want to make a note on synthesis here, because people ask what happens when synthesis of Ibogaine occurs. That will help take pressure off the natural resource, but it doesn't fix all the problems. So I want to just sort of give an analogy here to help explain this. So imagine there's a small village shop which is selling a plant to the local village, and that local village is being sustained. And then one day, a foreigner visits and realizes that they can take that plant and they can go to their own shop, and that shop can get bigger and it will get richer, and the demand from that shop will increase over time. Then one day, that small shop is forced to close because it realizes it has no resources left. The big shop can actually continue what he's doing because he realizes actually there's now another source that's producing the same plant. And there's also another alternative source over here. So he can just continue to grow and get bigger. But there is a choice here. he can turn back and acknowledge the original source and give an offering of gratitude because it was down to them that he was able to succeed in the first place. And that is the concept of reciprocity. Synthesis merely puts a plaster on a deep wound and it allows people to walk away. Whereas reciprocity is helping to heal a wound that exists. Okay. So now I want to move on to the concept of Indigenous washing. This is a term that we coined, myself and my co-author, for an article that we wrote for Drug Science. And it's based on the concept of greenwashing, which is used in the environmental industry. And it is described as the deception of the public by industry that they are acting in the best interest of Indigenous people through either superficial statements or actions, where in fact they are covering up the theft of their lands, riches, or resources. Now, there are quite a few strong terms within that: superficial statements, deception, and theft. But actually, this is what has been happening with Indigenous people. Just going to ask people to have a moment to check in and see what's coming up for them when I talk about these issues, because sometimes there can be resonance with what's being said, particularly if you've ever been in a position of minority. There may be a sense of neutrality, and sometimes defensiveness shows up, being like, what can I do now? What am I supposed to say? And just to say all of it is welcome. But it's just something that needs to be highlighted. So, to give you an example, the increasing number of requests from conferences to have Indigenous voices and representation there. Now, on the surface, this looks like a good thing. But what is the meaningful exchange for the Indigenous communities that this person has come from? For example, from Gabon, they are French speaking, and so they need multiple logistical considerations. The need for translators. Has there been thought about them traveling to the destination? They'll often need visas, they will need passports. And then what happens to the communities that they leave behind? Are they supporting their families? What is their role within their communities? You may have noticed in some of the festivals that we have Buiti musicians. So if they've been taken from their communities, who is now part of their ceremonies there? Does it leave a hole behind what's happening? These are just questions to answer or consider. One organisation, in an attempt to have Indigenous representation, approached someone in Gabon when there was expertise available and inadvertently approached a known Iboga poacher. So, Blessings of the Forest had to intervene, just to let this be known. Other examples are Indigenous washing, are drug companies saying that their main motivation for synthesis of a molecule is to take pressure off the land and the people, where in fact the motivation is potentially something different. So what are the suggestions or the answers? The 3 R's. So reciprocity, which is what we've already discussed. Meaningful exchanges with communities. Now, often this is going to be monetary in nature, but care has to be considered here because giving money directly to communities can cause a number of complexities and issues, driving up local competition. So that's when the use of intercultural mediators can be vital in this situation. So, for example, Blessings of the Forest in Gabon, they support other income generating activities. So in the Iboga plantations, to keep elephants out and to prevent them trampling the Iboga seedlings, they've introduced beehives to keep them away. And from that, we now have a honey and beeswax trade. So another form of income for the communities. And the communities and Indigenous people came up with that for themselves. Respect. The first aspect of respect is to acknowledge our role in what we have been doing, where we have benefited at the expense of Indigenous people. And to acknowledge that relationship building takes time, and it has to be done with the right people and collectively, not individually in silos. So as part of my role at Drug Science, where I represent the medicine Iboga in terms of reciprocity, we've actually written a letter. We've sent a letter just addressed to the elders in Gabon and asked them, what are your opinions on reciprocity? Or what do you think of people using your medicine in the West? And people in Gabon, knowing that many of them are literate, cannot read, but we've given it to the communities, and there's a representative who is now collecting information from different people and communities in Gabon. We know that this will take time to come back to us, but when we receive the response, I will report back. Representation. Who is being asked to speak and give their voice? And have other members in that area consented to this? And do they agree with this? Does that particular person know who they are presenting to and the audience and the reach? So it'd be more beneficial perhaps to go to an audience and present in front of an audience where they would perhaps get funding, or they're able to make decisions based on policy change or anything to do with their actual medicine. Again, for representation in Gabon, there's over 53 different ethnicities. So now there's been an elected member, someone called Mube Boal, who's been elected to speak on behalf of those different communities. So he will be available to go to conferences, but you can't overburden him with all of the different ones that are happening. Okay, so as I start to close the talk, I'd like to bring a light onto Professor Jean-Noel Gasita. Now, we've heard in a few of the talks earlier, Howard Lotsof being mentioned as the founder of Ibogaine, who was the American scientist. Now, Professor Jean-Noel Gasita, he was the first Black African laureate at the Paris Academy of Medicine, and he was a leading authority of Iboga research. And when Lotsof ran out of Iboga in the 80s, it was Professor Gasita, who at the time was scientific advisor to the Gabonese government, got him an audience with the government, and then Gabon gifted Lotsof 40 kilos of Iboga to use for his research. So modern day Ibogaine research is based on Professor Jean-Noel Gasita. And I would really like you to join me in acknowledging him, knowing that his family will see a video. So if you would join me in a round of applause for his contribution to modern day science. Thank you. So, what can you do? The first thing to do is to have awareness. The next is to ask questions. Where is the medicine from? What is happening at the origin? What is happening to the people, to the land, and the cultures? Is what we're doing beneficial, or are we just simply Indigenous washing? Again, remembering that relationships take time to build. As the psychedelic medicine field continues to expand, we have a moment to stop and pause and reflect and acknowledge that we have benefited as a result of Indigenous people. Now we have an opportunity to restore the balance. Let's offer gratitude and acknowledgement to the Indigenous people who have stewarded and looked after our medicine so that we can now have it and be shared with the rest of the world. Thank you.